Being near death, the girl had a chance to save her life by being reborn as another person. She took this chance and became a noblewoman from a wealthy family. Unwittingly, the girl got involved in intrigues and scandals related to the princess she was reborn as. There is a threat to her life and attempts to seduce her by the scoundrel prince. If you subscribe, you will learn more, and don't miss the next episode. And give me a like for my efforts. On this day, the sun lit everything around except the passage between the houses, where everything was in shadow, and there was a lantern hanging at the beginning of the passage. The girl with pink hair was taking her time climbing the steps that seemed to never end. She leaned her hand against the wall and stopped for a moment and began to cough, covering her mouth with her hand. When she looked at her hand, she saw blood. At this moment, she became insanely scared, and tears appeared in her golden eyes. Her mouth and hand were covered in blood. Looking at the blood on her hand, she sobbed and said that she didn't want to die. Still, she continued onward and thought about the fact that her life had slid into the abyss due to the fault of one man. Because of this handsome brunette with brown eyes and a charming smile, when she was, her mother committed suicide because of his false accusation. When she arrived at her mother's room, she saw an overturned chair and her mother's breathless body. When she turned, the aristocrat in whose house she worked began molesting her. She tearfully asked him not to touch her, but he covered her mouth with his hand so she couldn't be heard. So she went from being the daughter of an aristocratic family to a bar waitress. She sat on the floor of the room, resting her hand on the wall, and coughed again, covering her mouth with her hand. There was blood on her face near her lips. She was now years old. She looked exhausted and sad. The girl looked sadly at her palm, which was covered in blood due to a lung disease that had no cure and was gradually shortening her life. She remembered how one fine sunny day, when she was under treatment at the Big Gray Estate, a visitor had come to her. One young beautiful brunette came here in a carriage. She was accompanied by two young men. This young person climbing the stairs began to visit her while she lived to await her death. It was Bertha Alberhart. During their conversation, she said that she wished she had a disease that shortened her life. Then smiling, she confessed that she envied her because she could die without effort. The girl with pink hair looked at her with her golden eyes in surprise and couldn't believe that such a charming girl could wish for her death. She looked down sadly and thought she was crazy and wondered if she enjoyed bullying unfortunate people. And so as she continued walking down the steps, she became sad and looked sadly ahead and thought, would she really die this way? Still, she looked resolutely forward and realized that this could not be allowed to happen because she wanted to live, even if she had to sell her soul to the devil to do so. Soon, she met someone who could help her. In a modest room, she and the man sat at a table. The fireplace was lit, illuminating everything around them and filling the room with warmth. A man with silver hair and green eyes looked at her and said he had a good offer for her. He suggested she swap Mrs. Alberhart's body, dreaming of death, with her body stricken with a deadly disease. This man had reached out to her, and it was up to her to accept it or not. At first, she was surprised at such a suggestion, for she had not even thought of such a thing before. But then she agreed, and then she laughed hysterically, as if mad. That day, the evil inside her was awakened. As she shifted into Bertha's body, she was visited by Butler, who, to her surprise, was strangely expressing his attention to his mistress. Apparently, they were lovers and slept together occasionally, or perhaps regularly. Bertha couldn't contain the pleasure the butler brought her. Her cheeks flushed. He, on the other hand, licked his lips in satisfaction. He wiped the tears from her eyes and fixed her hair. She looked up at him in embarrassment. The butler smiled and looked at her gently with his gray eyes. His hair was slightly mussed. Then he said, "You are beautiful, my mistress." Outside the window, we could see a blue sky with white clouds floating across it and the sun illuminating everything around us. The butler stood beside Bertha, who was sitting on the bed, and said that the Earl of Lawrence's family had a very promising political future, and the day would come when she would enjoy this marriage. He adjusted his clothes, put his monocle on the rules of his eye, and taking her hand, kissed it tenderly. Then he turned around and quietly said she should rest. Then he left as if nothing had happened, and the girl who was in Bertha's body looked at his back with horror on her face and thought what kind of life Bertha had really lived. Still, she decided to take a bath as soon as possible, where she felt much better. Of course, this whole situation and Butler's actions were strange and unpleasant to her. She remembered Butler's satisfied face and thought that she was not the real Bertha, and so there was no need for her to put up with all this. Still, she realized that she couldn't raise doubts that she wasn't the real Bertha, so she would have to bear it. She sighed and decided that she needed to watch Butler. After lying in the bathtub for a while longer, she decided it was time to do other things. Getting out of the bathroom, she grabbed a sky-colored towel and hurried to clean herself up. The luxurious estate where Bertha lived was illuminated by the rays of the sun, and the blue sky was covered with white clouds. Before the body swap, and up until this moment, Rita had always had to hide her anger. In her previous life, she had not had the strength to be angry, but that now she could take a long walk in the beautiful garden. When she saw the beautiful roses, she stopped and approached the flowers. The pink roses had a beautiful fragrance. She reached out her hand to the one flower that looked the prettiest. Then she abruptly plucked the flower and crushed it in her hand, making the petals and leaves fly apart. It was a reminder of her life, which had been weighing her down whenever she tried to get stronger. Then she went to the manor house and stood for some time looking at the family portrait of Bertha and her parents. She realized that the miserable life she had lived before was dead. And now she is the Count's beautiful daughter, Bertha Alberhart. After a while, back in her room, she opened the door abruptly and shouted loudly, "Everybody in here!" The maids looked fearfully in her direction and hurried to her room. The first thing they did was get her dresses ready. One maid was adjusting her pink dress with yellow bows. The other maids brought a lilac dress with pink bows and a blue dress with white bows and ruffles. There were also other dresses, among them a peach-colored dress with white ruffles and gold embroidery, as well as a lettuce-colored dress decorated with a pink rose and the same color ribbon. Bertha sat on the couch with her leg tucked up on the leg and looked closely at all the dresses. It became clear to her that past Bertha's preferences were too predictable. She reached out and decided she needed to change that. She looked at the maids and asked which of them could write the fastest. One girl with russet hair and green eyes raised her hand. She was wearing a maid's uniform and apron and a brooch that matched her eye color. Bertha stood up and told the maid to take a paper and write down everything she told her to do. The maid replied that she would do everything. Bertha stood in front of the dresses and, pointing her hand at them, said that the dresses from here to here should be thrown away. The maid asked in surprise if it was necessary to throw everything away, but when she saw Bertha's determined look, she realized she was not joking. Then Bertha walked over to the blue dress with black bows and white ruffles and looked at it thoughtfully for some time. The maid stood beside her, silently watching and waiting for further instructions. Suddenly, she abruptly took the piece of paper from the maid's hands and said that these dresses needed a little fixing to make them more wearable. On the example of the pink dress, she drew what should be the neckline and also said to make the neckline on the back deeper, get rid of all the jewelry on the top of the dress and remove the ruffles. Bertha tossed the sheet to the maid as if nothing had happened, and the maid was at a loss to understand anything she had written. It was not clear to her what changes had occurred in the mind of her mistress, who wanted to alter the dress she liked best. Bertha informed the maids that they would finish organizing the closet at this point. She asked them to collect spring season brochures from the capital stores within a week. The maids who were collecting her dresses were surprised. When they heard her order, they all replied together, "Very well, mistress." For Jeannie and Sona, who were holding her dresses, Bertha had a separate assignment. She asked them to follow her. The maids looked at each other in surprise, trying to figure out what she wanted them to do, and then obediently followed her. They arrived at the door of the right room, and Bertha asked them to stand by the door and wait for her there, and Bertha herself entered the room, leaving the surprised maids outside the door. Bertha walked quickly into the room and stopped in the middle of the room. She had done all this for a reason. She smiled and looked at the door. It was clear from her sly look that she was up to something. Bertha quickly removed her shoes, trying to keep her balance so she wouldn't fall. Then, taking the shoes in her hands, she walked as quietly as possible to the door. Pressing herself against the door, she listened intently to what the maids, who knew everything that was going on in the house, were saying. Bertha was sure when they got bored waiting, they would start talking about this and that, and she would be able to learn about a lot of things. The maids, meanwhile, stood silently by the door, each of them thinking about something. It had been a long time, but the sun from behind the clouds was still shining through the window they had been looking through for a long time. On the floor, they could see the shadow of the curtains and window frames. Sona sighed heavily and said that Mistress was running late. She asked Jean if she knew why Mistress had called them. Jean looked at her and replied that perhaps Mistress wanted to move the furniture in the room because the Earl of Lawrence was coming next week. Sona clenched her fists and said excitedly that Jean knew how their mistress felt about the engagement. She asked her if she thought Mistress wanted to change the arrangement to make herself look good in the Count's eyes. Bertha continued to eavesdrop intently on their conversation. She had been right that the former mistress of the body was not enthusiastic about the engagement. Jean hesitated and replied that she didn't think the Count particularly liked the mistress either. She said that the Count came with his friend all the time, and they both seemed strange to her. In addition, she did not understand why the Count's friend was always accompanying him. Suddenly, Jean realized that he was doing this because he was his knight, and also he had a good body, but his face wasn't exactly expressive. Bertha is alarmed that the Count comes to his fiancée's house every time with a friend, but she was shocked when she learned that the Earl of Lawrence is the right-hand man of the Marquis Carter. The maid thought that was why their master wanted to betroth her daughter to him. Bertha blushed and covered her mouth with her hand to keep from making a sound. She looked down at the floor in surprise, for she had never realized that her fiancé and her enemy had such a relationship. It was strange to her that she had forgotten about Marquis Carter, who had caused her whole life to go down the drain. She was in a different body now, and this was an opportunity to get back at him for everything. She smiled and thought she liked Bertha's life. Despite what she had heard, she continued to listen to the maids talk. One of them said that she had always wondered about the truth of a story. The maid said that Marquis Carter drove the Baron's young widow to suicide, and her daughter was abandoned to her fate. The other maid asked if she thought Baron Walker had anything to do with Marquis Carter. Bertha excitedly continued to eavesdrop on them. The maid replied that they would never know about it. For Bertha, the story was known because it was about her when she was Rita. Now she was sure everything would be all right. Since she was Bertha, she had the opportunity to find out for herself. She smiled cheerfully and said, "Wait, Fraud Carter." She was glad. For once she knew everything. She would be able to take double revenge on those who had been responsible for her mother's death and her terribly difficult life. The maids continued to stand at the door. It was obvious that they were tired. Sona rubbed her eyes, and Jean looked thoughtfully at her fingers. Sona was apparently so tired and wanted to sleep, so she even started yawning so hard that a tear appeared in her left eye. Suddenly, Bertha opened the door abruptly, causing the maids' eyes to widen with surprise. They turned and looked at Bertha, awaiting further instructions, who stood before them, swinging the door open with her arms. Smiling, Bertha said she wished to do some perfume organizing and asked her to bring her all her perfumes. The maids brought quickly her perfume, which was in different bottles and had an incredible odor. Bertha realized that perfume was an invisible veil. As she looked at these colorful bottles, which cost no small amount, she was reminded that men were so vulnerable to smells. When she was Rita and working in a bar, even cheap perfume could attract men. Bertha picked up the pink bottle and splashed a few drops of perfume on herself. She was sure that such an expensive perfume would do a much better job. You could tell from the expression on her face that she was satisfied. Although her closet was mediocre, her perfume collection was luxurious. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and then the door opened, and Butler entered the room. Bertha looked at him unhappily. He came to inform her that the meeting with her fiancé, which was supposed to take place next week, would take place this week. Butler also asked her to open her heart for the sake of a strong relationship between the two families. Bertha looked down and asked him if he would come again accompanied by his friend. After hesitating for a couple of seconds, she clarified if he would be accompanied by the very same Baron. The butler replied that he would also come with him. Bertha asked in surprise why Baron Jacquard came every time without missing a single appointment. To her eyes, he looked like a servant who was faithfully devoted to his master. She looked angrily at Butler and asked if he agreed with her. The butler looked away and replied that he didn't know, and if she had no assignments for him, he would leave. Then he bowed quickly and left her room. His behavior made Bertha wonder. She couldn't understand why Butler avoided talking about the groom's friend, and when he did talk about him, he looked different. Earl Lawrence and his friend were strange in her opinion. The day came when her fiancé's carriage was fast approaching her estate. The maids helped Bertha get ready to meet the Count. She wore a gorgeous black dress, which was decorated with golden embroidery and ribbon, as well as black ruffles on one shoulder. Her hair complemented the whole image wonderfully. Putting a white flower with pearls on her dress, her image was complete. Rita liked her new body very much. Suddenly, she looked at the wrist of her hand and saw the scars that told her that the former Bertha had attempted suicide. She was furious because she didn't understand how Bertha could have hurt such a beautiful body. Still, she decided to wear the bracelet so it wouldn't be so noticeable. Jean, who had entered the room, informed her of the arrival of her fiancé and his friend. As she did so, she asked if she would invite them into her room. Bertha turned around and replied, "Yes, let them come in." Jean carefully placed the tea and cups on the table and went to inform the guests that they could join Mistress. Having carried out her orders, she quickly turned back to Bertha, awaiting further instructions. Smiling, Bertha said she had sent Sona on an errand, so she wanted Jean to stay with her. For Jean, it was extremely strange for her mistress to wish for something that went against all norms, so she looked at her in surprise and said so. Even though Jean was right, Bertha had a bad feeling. When she heard the footsteps of the men who were getting closer and closer, Bertha decided to act immediately. She walked over to a white cabinet that was decorated with golden designs. Jean followed obediently, not understanding what her mistress wanted from her. Bertha opened the closet abruptly. The closet held a single mop for mopping the floor. She realized that the space was enough for a person to fit in there. Bertha smiled and looked at Jean, who asked in surprise and uncertainty, "Mistress, do you really want to?" Before she could finish, Bertha replied, "What are you standing up for? Get in." The Count and the Baron walked quickly to her room. The maids who saw them blushed with embarrassment and said they were handsome. Earl Lawrence had black hair and brown eyes. He was shorter in stature than Baron Jacquard, who had russet hair and violet-colored eyes. When the Count met Bertha, he smiled, and holding out his hand said cheerfully, "Bertha, my beautiful bride." Bertha smiled back and pulled her hand hand and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Jean kissed her hand gently and said admiringly that she looked so elegant. She smiled embarrassedly, and even a blush appeared on her cheeks, and thought to herself that he was okay. It wasn't just the Count who devoured her with his eyes, but also the Baron who was standing nearby. Baron Jacquard took her hand and also kissed it tenderly. Bertha had heard that he was lonely and had no heirs to receive his entire fortune. She wondered if that was why he was playing the role of Jin's guard and servant, but it was still strange to her that he came to his friends' meetings every time. Smiling, Bertha looked at him and said, "Since he came again, he has a lot of free time." Baron Jacquard looked her confidently in the eye and said she was right. Bertha immediately realized that he was a strong opponent, but she didn't show any concern and just smiled back. Baron Jacquard continued to hold her hand, and then he looked at her strangely. It wasn't a normal look. Bertha was at a loss. She did not understand what that look was, and Baron Jacquard himself seemed very gloomy. She slowly took her hand back, though Baron probably wasn't happy about it. Bertha smiled at them and said that she hoped the treats they had prepared would please them both. She sat down on the red-colored couch and kindly invited them to sit down. There was tea and cups on the table and many different pastries and sweets. The Count and Baron looked at each other, and then they looked at Bertha, who had no clue about anything, with a sneer on their faces. The first to sit down was the Count opposite his bride, and for some reason the Baron sat down next to Bertha, which surprised and embarrassed her very much at the same time. She became uneasy, for she did not understand what they were doing. Bertha looked anxiously at the Count. Her fiancé smiled back at her, pretending that nothing scary or surprising had happened. Bertha was not confused, and smiled back at him, and thought that it was not normal for a groom to seat another man next to his bride and smile at the same time. The Baron sat still and awaited instructions from the Count. From the Count's look, the Baron realized that action was necessary. The Baron looked at Bertha, who focused her attention on her fiancé. He moved toward her and shoved her sharply with his shoulder. The surprised Bertha didn't realize what was happening. The Count said with a smile that he thought she was fine with it today. Then he asked her if she had finally changed her mind. Bertha didn't understand what she was talking about, but she decided to answer ambiguously. She said that she could not give up something that could strengthen their relationship, but that it would not be advisable to rush it. The Count smilingly replied that she was smart enough. Bertha could see the interest in his eyes, but still he was cautious. When she looked at his lips, she felt irritation and annoyance at the same time. Still, she continued to smile at him, assuming that the Count was not in love with Bertha. The Count's cheeks reddened, and he looked at the Baron, giving him a sign to act. The Baron stood up abruptly, making Bertha uncomfortable. He grabbed her arm and put her down on the couch, not giving her a chance to get out from under him. Bertha looked at him fearfully, not realizing what was happening. Baron began kissing her while restraining her hands. As soon as he stopped kissing, Bertha shouted for him not to do it. But Baron didn't listen to her and continued to kiss her further, pressing her with his body and restraining her hands. But his actions didn't end with the kiss. He grabbed the girl by the waist. A confused Bertha had not expected this. She screamed for him not to touch her. His heavy body pressed against her, making it impossible for her to move. The Baron paid no attention to her cries, but continued to kiss her neck. He squeezed the nipple a little, and Bertha couldn't contain the passionate desire that filled her body. The Baron didn't stop. Bertha was pleased. Suddenly, Bertha sharply pushed him away from her and demanded that he stop touching her. The Baron had not expected her to be capable of such a thing. Bertha, though she looked frail, she made it clear with all the fury in her eyes that she had no intention of tolerating his molestation of her any longer. But it didn't seem to work on the Baron. He licked his finger and looked at her passionately, eager to continue. The Baron looked again at the Count, waiting for permission, who was silently watching everything. The Count asked Bertha, "How does it feel to be kissed in front of your fiancé, Bertha?" His question shocked her even more. Bertha couldn't believe it was her fiancé. She wiped her lips with her hand and mentally answered him, "What do you think? I feel gross." The Count's face flushed with the pleasure he derived from watching them. He looked at her with satisfaction and said that her pale, fragile body, under the hard pressure of the large and strong Jacquard, was incredibly beautiful. To his eyes, it looked as if an angel had been crushed by the devil. Bertha could see that he enjoyed what he saw and was extremely excited. She looked at him angrily. Now it was clear to her why the old Bertha had been against the engagement. The Count smiled happily and said he liked it and suggested we move on to the next item. But Bertha wondered if they should end it there because she needed to get used to it. The Count looked at her irritably and said, "How dull you are! What's the matter with you?" His next words shocked her even more. The Count said that he knew Butler Ian was able to relax her body. He wondered if she had slept slept with him yet. The Count thought Butler would be helpful, but apparently he was mistaken. Bertha remembered the day Butler had been in her room, holding her hand and worrying about her, and the way he tried to satisfy her. It was all for the Count. Now she understood why Ian had seemed suspicious. Bertha felt vile, but she wasn't going to fulfill her fiancé's every whim. The Count said sadly that he wished Butler had also attended his and her wedding night, and then Bertha realized that she had fallen into a trap orchestrated by the three men. The Count picked up his fork and proceeded to dessert. He said that this is why trust is the most important thing. After all, from the beginning to the end, you will suspect a person. He also explained that he couldn't give her any more indulgences, so he firmly told Baron to get started. Bertha felt at that moment that he wasn't joking. Fear swept through her body. The Baron began to approach her quickly, while Bertha backed away from the closet and demanded that he stay back. She also said she would scream if he didn't stop. But the Baron didn't hear her and stepped right up to her. No matter how hard Bertha tried to restrain his hand, he still touched her face and was ready to kiss her again. But suddenly he was stopped by Jean's shout, who demanded that he remove his dirty hands. The Count looked anxiously at the maid. Bertha, whose face was held by the Baron's hand, looked with hope in her eyes at the fearless Jean, who was trying to help her. The Baron looked with anger in his eyes at the maid, who dared to interrupt him at such an important moment. Even though Jean was extremely embarrassed and outraged at the same time, she resolutely held the mop in her hands and quickly went to defend her mistress. Jean swung the mop hard at Baron, as if she were a knight holding a sword in her hands and defending her mistress from a villain. Baron deftly dodged the blow, but she didn't stop there. With all her might, she struck him once more with the mop, angrily shouting, "How dare you threaten mistress in her own house? Is that what a gentleman does?" Bertha, who had been silently watching everything, began to admire her fearless defender. She even covered her mouth with her hands in admiration and thought that Jean was tough. The Baron was angry, but he could do nothing and stood silently. The Count smiled and said that today he had done a rash thing. He bowed to Bertha and apologized to her, as there had been a slight misunderstanding on both sides. Then he said they would see each other next time, and together with the Baron, he quickly left. From the look on his face, it was obvious that he was extremely displeased that some maid had interfered with his plans. Jeanne opened the window, and fresh air filled her mistress's bedroom. Bertha sat down on the couch and breathed a sigh of relief. She realized that things could have ended badly. Jean stood beside me. Her cheeks were still red, and tears were coming from her eyes. She asked Bertha if she was okay. She also apologized for her actions. She felt guilty for interfering and causing unnecessary problems for her, but Bertha didn't think so. She asked Jean to go and fetch the butler. The girl quickly ran to do her bidding. As Jean descended the stairs, she held onto the banister with one hand and wiped her tears with the other. She blamed herself for interfering in her mistress's conversation and raising her hand against the Baron. She realized that Bertha might fire her. After a while, Jean returned to Bertha's room and told her that she had brought Butler. Bertha stared silently out the window with her back to the door. The butler quickly approached Bertha with Jean and asked quietly, "Madam, were you looking for me?" When she turned around, Butler looked at her worriedly, but didn't say a word. Bertha looked pale. The lipstick on her face was wiped off, and her hair was disheveled. Her eyes were cold, like glass, and showed no emotion. She said quietly, "Ian." The butler dutifully replied, "Yes." He guessed that it was most likely the Count's fault. Bertha looked at him resolutely and asked him to triple Jean's salary right now. Not only Jean, but also Butler looked at her in surprise. The butler bowed obediently and said he understood and would do her bidding. A blushing Jean, who was ready to be dismissed, stood by and nervously clenched her fingers. Bertha walked up to her and smiling said that Jean was henceforth her personal maid, and now she would not have to clean, but would sit and wait for her instructions. Jean tearfully said, how could she accept her offer? But Bertha replied, "That's an order. You may go now." Jean quickly replied that she would follow her orders. She still couldn't believe that she had gotten a promotion and not a dismissal. She bowed to Bertha and quickly left her room. Jean was overjoyed that she would continue to serve her mistress. As soon as Jean left, Butler and Bertha were alone in her room. They were silent for some time. Then Bertha looked angrily at Butler and asked if it was so much fun for him to grovel before her fiancé and please her instead. The butler lowered his head and looking away calmly replied that he didn't know what she was talking about. When Bertha heard this, she became even more angry. She went up to him and asked him if he really didn't understand. Bertha sharply unbuttoned his shirt. The butler looked at her in surprise, not realizing what was happening. Then she got to her jacket and did the same thing to it, that even the buttons hit the floor. The butler did not resist, but stood still. Bertha whispered softly that she would show him what it would be like to be in her place. She looked into his eyes as if trying to read all his thoughts and said that Baron Jacquard had kissed her in this room. Bertha began to squeeze Butler's chest and then let him feel the same thing she had experienced. Butler butler's cheeks instantly flushed with excitement, but he didn't even try to resist his mistress, who had no intention of stopping. Bertha smiled and whispered that Count Lawrence had said that if she changed her mind, they could share the pleasure in threes. Finally, the butler could not stand this heat of emotion and said, "Ah, mistress." She touched her hand to his face and looked contemptuously into his eyes and asked if the Count had promised him this. The butler looked forward fearfully and remained silent. It was clear that he was involved in this too, and the Count's words were true. Bertha let him go, and Butler began to dress. Finally, he quietly replied that he didn't know what she was talking about. She asked if that was why he kept trying to talk her into accepting the engagement. As he dressed, he held his shirt with his hand and replied that union between members of the upper classes is mostly by agreement, and to neglect the private life of a future wife at an early stage of a relationship is not quite right. When Bertha heard his reply, she couldn't hold back all the anger and indignation that overwhelmed her. She shouted loudly at him to shut up. Her face was red, and her eyes filled with anger, hatred, and contempt for him. Bertha shouted menacingly, "Don't get in my face again! Do you understand me?" But Butler didn't even flinch, but looked her straight in the eye and quietly replied that it was impossible, because she wasn't the one who had hired him for the job. Bertha couldn't stand his insolent face and behavior. She slapped him with all her might, which made his cheek even redder. The butler still couldn't believe his eyes that his quiet mistress, who had constantly tolerated everything, had changed so drastically and even hit him. Bertha then demanded that he get out of her room, and as if not noticing him, walked past. The butler looked silently at the back of his mistress, who was rapidly moving away from him and was no longer a quiet woman, but a real formidable lady. After a while, Bertha was sitting at a table in the gazebo that was located in the garden. She was enjoying the tranquility of the fresh air. There was tea on the table and various sweets, cakes, pastries, and fruit. Bertha quietly drank her tea and thought about what had happened. She looked at her hand and saw that her wrist was bruised from Baron Jacquard's strong grip on her. To her, they were disgusting creatures. The thought of asking Count Alberhart for help came to Bertha, but immediately she refused to do so because the Count is the person who insists on marriage more than anyone else. Naturally, she realized that he would not help her, but on the contrary, would support her fiancé, so she had to find a way out of the situation on her own. Bertha was eating cookies and wondering what she should do and what to do next. Suddenly, she heard someone calling her. It was Jean, who quickly ran to her. Bertha asked what had happened. The excited Jean replied that the fortune teller she had asked about had arrived. Bertha, who had been looking at the maid in surprise, smiled instantly and asked Jean to have her escort the fortune teller to her room and also call the butler. Bertha made her way to her room to see her long-awaited guest. She walked down the luxurious corridor with gold-carved ornaments, candlesticks, and lamps on the walls, and marble floors harmonizing with everything. As she approached the room, she saw Butler waiting for her. Bertha angrily asked, "What's the matter?" Butler continued to stare at her intently, trying to figure out what she was up to. Bertha went to the door and was about to open it when suddenly Butler asked who was the person waiting for them inside. Bertha looked at him with a sly smile and replied that she wouldn't tell him that. The butler looked at her in surprise and confusion. He did not know what to expect from such a treacherous woman. He tried to ask her something, but she interrupted him. Bertha calmly said that he shouldn't take everything so seriously because he would soon find out about everything himself. He wanted to say something, but this time he was interrupted by the maid, who quickly ran to him to inform him that the gardener was looking for him on urgent business. Bertha fixed her hair and with a smile told him to go to the gardener. The butler could not help but disobey her order, so he obediently went along with the maid. Turning around, he looked suspiciously at Bertha, assuming she had set the whole thing up. Bertha stood silently by the door and looked at him for a while, smiling contentedly. She stood proudly with her head up and looked boldly into his eyes. The butler was shocked and puzzled. He lowered his head and wondered why she had changed so much. It was all too strange to him. As soon as Butler left, Bertha went into her room where she saw her guest sitting on the couch. This guest was wearing a gray hooded cloak that you couldn't even see her face. As soon as Bertha approached her, the guest stood up and bowed to greet her and said it was a pleasure to meet her. Bertha looked at her irritably and said angrily, "What kind of mistress am I to you? You know perfectly well who is standing in front of you." But the guest didn't answer anything, but continued to stand by her side. Bertha sat down on the sofa and said that the guest was really so bad. Then Bertha suggested that she take off her hood, for there was no one else in the room but her. As soon as the guest removed her hood, Bertha saw before her a beautiful young man with silver hair and green-colored eyes. He sat down on the couch across from her and asked if she liked her new body. Bertha fixed her hair, smiled, and replied cheerfully that she was beautiful, rich, and healthy now, and had no reason to hate her new body. He thought for a moment, then said he was curious to know why the past owner of the body had dreamed of suicide. Still, he noted that the forbidden magic worked perfectly. Bertha replied that everything had happened because of Elsa. He replied that it was just a deal, so she shouldn't thank him. Then Bertha said cheerfully, since Elsa had come to her so soon, did what she thought had happened. He looked at her calmly and replied that she was right. The past Bertha that had moved into her body had passed away. Bertha smiled contentedly and asked, "Really?" Elsa looked at her worriedly and asked if she had forgotten the terms of their deal. Bertha cheerfully replied that she remembered that and asked what she needed to do. For a moment, Elsa's face became sad, and he thought about something important, and then he replied that he didn't need anything for now. As soon as Bertha had finished talking to him, she asked John to help her change, and in a short time, she was quickly in the carriage. Carriage of white color, adorned with gilded carved ornaments, was rushing along a forest path where there were many green trees and bushes all around. Bertha, due to the morning, was dressed in a black dress with ruffles and decorations of blue color. On her head, she had a cap of blue color with a golden brooch. She was looking out of the window in thought. Then she took out a mirror and looked at her reflection in it. Her cheeks were red and her eyes were sad and tearful. She quickly closed the mirror. Bertha was pleased with her new face and body. She smiled happily and looked out the window and said that today she was as beautiful as ever. Suddenly the carriage stopped and someone tapped on the carriage window, letting her know that they had arrived and it was time for her to get out. It was the coachman. He opened the carriage door and Bertha, lifting her dress, carefully tried to get out. The coachman gave her his hand and helped her out of the carriage. She walked quickly to the manor where the past owner of this body had been treated and spent her last days. She was met by a man who was taller than her with green hair and green eyes. Since he worked there, he quickly escorted her to the morgue where her former body was located. They approached the table, where Rita's body lay covered with a white cloth, and stopped. The man sadly told them that her illness had worsened and she had died 2 days ago in the night. Bertha looked at her old body in disgust and covering her nose with a handkerchief thought, "What a stench." The man said sadly that he was sorry, for she was very young. Bertha cried and wiping her tears with a handkerchief said that she should have visited her more often. She bent down in front of the dead body and tearfully mourned for Rita, covering her mouth with her hand. Then she grabbed the part of the cloth that covered the dead body and pulled at it. Bertha wanted to make sure Rita was dead. As soon as the cloth slid away, she saw Rita's gaunt face with blue lips and open mouth. She smiled happily because this dead body had once belonged to her. She covered her nose again with her handkerchief, and from the look on Rita's face, she realized that the cough was bothering her to no end. Sadly continuing to look at the body, she thought about the fact that Rita had had a horrible life that had started 10 years ago and continued until recently. Memories of her childhood came over her. She remembered the big brown-colored mansion she lived in, with a garden beside it. On the day that changed her life forever, she was wearing a beautiful lavender-colored dress and joyfully playing the piano. While playing, she was surreptitiously watching her mother and their guest. The guest said he needed to check on the condition of the crops, but it was a 2-day journey from his house to the farm, so he asked permission to stay with them for 3 weeks. Her mother was a modest woman with pink hair and golden-colored eyes like hers. She embarrassedly replied that it was not customary for a master from another family to stay in a mansion where only she and her daughter lived. He smiled as he fixed his black hair and looked at her with his brown eyes and suggested that she invite Sir Charles Walker and his son, who was the brother of her husband, the late Baron Walker, to live in her mansion with him. Her mom thought for a moment. She remembered that in society it was considered normal to stay for a while in other families' mansions. So she answered him that although their mansion was dilapidated and not up to his standards, she thought he could stay with them. The guest smiled contentedly. He gently kissed her mother's fragile hand and thanked her for allowing him to stay at their mansion. Although her mother was a widow, she was still young, and such an attitude from a man opened her heart again to new love. The guest smiled at her without embarrassment, trying to win her heart with his beauty and advances. Although her mom seemed shy and unapproachable, she was actually pleased to have this man's attention. Rita, watching everything, saw her young and naive mother fall in love with their guest, Fraud Carter, in less than 2 weeks. One evening, as she was waiting for him in her room, being dressed only in her nightie, when she heard a knock at the door, she said cheerfully, "Come in, Frood." But when she saw who had entered her room, she could not move from her seat with horror. A very different man entered her room, eating her up happily with his eyes. It was one of the servants. The man thanked her for inviting him into her bedroom and said he was honored to serve her. Her mother asked in a trembling voice where Frood was and why the man had come to her. The man grabbed her arm and threw her on the bed, pressing her down with his body. No matter how hard she screamed and tried, she couldn't break free because he held her arms tightly. Then he started kissing her neck and whispering something. Her eyes filled with tears, she shouted loudly, "Help!" At her scream, her late husband's brother and his son, as well as Rita, ran into the room. Everyone was shocked to see her on the bed with the servant. Rita tearfully cried out, "Mother!" She couldn't believe her eyes that her mother was having a secret affair with this man. She nervously grabbed the hand of her cousin, who was standing nearby. Her uncle had called her mom a lying cheater. He was very angry and shouted angrily that she'd been having fun with a servant all this time in secret from his brother. Hearing this, the crying Rita looked at the angry uncle with fear in her eyes. After saying this, the cousin abruptly took back his hand that she was holding and said that he doubted whether Rita was Baron Walker's daughter. Because of what happened, Rita, along with her mother, were banished from the mansion and within 3 days erased from the family crest. 10 years later, Rita worked in a small bar that had many customers. She was no longer an aristocrat, but a commoner. There was a booth in this bar that had different job postings, or that some people or criminals were wanted. Rita was already terminally ill. She was sitting with her arm against the wall, coughing and covering her mouth with her hand. Her hand and mouth were covered in blood. She looked very tired from this life and the constant pain. Rita thought that if she had committed suicide right away, like her mother, she would not have had to suffer for so long. She stood up abruptly and walked over to the booth. She quickly wiped her mouth and face with the announcement. Suddenly, her gaze stopped on him. When she opened the piece of paper, she saw that it showed a portrait of a man. It said that the woman Elsa, who killed the sorcerer of the state of Todd, was wanted. The reward was 12,000. When she looked closely at the portrait, she realized that she had seen this man before, and then she remembered that it was a man who lived in the neighboring house. But what was strange to her was that the ad said it was a woman. Suddenly, someone called out to her and told her to go to him quickly. Rita quickly replied that she was on her way. She put the ad in her apron pocket and decided to visit the doctor after work. In the evening, she quickly went to the 3-story huge mansion for a doctor's appointment. The doctor quietly said that the test results had come back and handed her 2 sheets of paper to read it all in person. He said sadly that she should prepare for the worst. After his words, Rita left his office and slowly walked outside. She didn't want to believe that her life would end like this, and she would die soon. Rita was completely immersed in her grief, not noticing the people around her. She couldn't understand why her life was the way it was. She walked over to the wall and sat down on the ground, holding onto it. Rita didn't understand why this was happening to her. So many unfortunate things have happened to her since then. First, her father died, then her mother, and now she would die soon. Rita felt hurt and resentful. She said sadly, "Why me? Why?" Sometime later, when she was in the hospital, a young lady came to see her again. Rita came to the box room, where there were 2 chairs on opposite sides of the wall, and they were separated by a half-glass wall. She didn't understand how this girl never tired of coming to her every time. In fact, Rita wished she would stop coming to her and leave her alone. It was Bertha. She looked at her sadly. It was obvious that she sympathized with Rita. Rita's face was gaunt and pale because of her illness. She looked coldly at Bertha and wondered what she would talk about today. Suddenly, Bertha had tears in her eyes and sadly confessed that she envied Rita because she could sink into a cozy death sleep without pain and suffering. Hearing this, Rita was surprised, not understanding why she was saying such a thing. Bertha then showed her her hand, where her wrist had scars from trying to slit her veins. She asked Rita if she wanted to know why she was jealous of her. Rita was shocked at her words. She did not understand how such a young, beautiful, and rich girl could not value her life. Rita was beyond angry, thinking that Bertha was mocking or teasing her. After their conversation, Rita went outside and started beating her fists on the tree, screaming that Bertha was jealous that she was dying. She thought since she wanted to die so badly, she could die instead. Bitter tears continued to drip from her eyes. She said desperately, I want to live." A little calmer, Rita looked up at the sky and the white clouds in it. A small breeze quietly ruffled her pink hair, stroked invisible palms over her face, soothing her. Suddenly, a brown-colored carriage pulled up to the La Idelle mansion where she was being treated. She realized that some aristocrat had arrived. Rita hid behind a tree so no one would see her and wanted to find out who the carriage belonged to. As soon as the carriage came to a stop, 2 servants quickly approached it, greeting the aristocrats who had arrived. The door opened, and Rita saw a young, handsome blonde man with golden eyes. She recognized him immediately. It was Grand Duke Van Brandt. He was also the Supreme Judge of Osland and an investor of La Idelle. From the first time she saw him, she liked him very much. As she continued to watch him, she saw that there was another person in the carriage. As soon as he started to get out of the carriage, Rita thought she had seen him before, and she was not mistaken. She realized with horror that this was the man who had caused her many misfortunes. It was none other than Fraud Carter, who had come to their estate a very long time ago and seduced her mother. And now this horrible man came to the treatment center with the Duke and smilingly accompanied him. Rose watched him in surprise, not understanding why he had come here. After all, this area was funded by the Grand Duke Van Brandt. She overheard their conversation. The Duke thought it was the duty of a nobleman to attend to such matters. Fraud Carter said with a smile that he thought the Duke was doing a magnanimous thing by by taking care of the sick commoners. But the Duke calmly replied that he need not praise him so much, for Marquis Carter himself also does many good things. When she heard that he was the Marquis, Rosa looked at him angrily. She remembered that 10 years ago he had fought over the inheritance with his sister, and seeing him so happy now, she realized that he had finally succeeded in getting the inheritance and becoming a Marquis. Then they went back to the carriage again. The Duke told him to be careful on his way and bade him goodbye and left. The Marquis bade him farewell and continued to smile as he saw the Duke off. The Duke quickly got into the carriage and headed home. As soon as the carriage pulled away, the Marquis's smile disappeared from his face and his cold gaze became uncomfortable. He quickly turned around and walked down the steps to the manor. When Rosa saw her enemy, she wanted to live even more. She stared at him hatefully and, hiding behind a tree, decided that she had to survive, even if she had to sell her soul to the devil. She was in a different body now, but she was still sad. She realized that if it hadn't been for Elsa, she would have been lying there, mentally saying goodbye to Bertha. Rosa thought that now she might not envy her and rest in peace. She wanted to touch her face, but the man next to her prevented her from doing so. He shouted with horror on his face for her to be careful. He explained that even though the girl was dead, the disease was still contagious. She immediately covered her nose and was very angry at this man who should have told her this earlier. But then she cried and asked him if there was no one to take Rosa's body. The man looked at her sadly and replied that unfortunately she didn't have any relatives. Bertha took the gold ring off her finger and said she wanted to take her corpse. She also asked him to cremate Rosa's body, offering the ring as a thank you. The man was surprised at first, but when he saw the ring, he immediately smiled happily. He took the ring Bertha had given him and put it in his pocket. Continuing to smile happily, the man said that Bertha had a beautiful heart. But suddenly someone called out to him and their conversation was interrupted. Hans turned around in surprise. At the door stood the Grand Duke van Brandt. He looked at Hans and said, "You were here." Hans quickly approached him and anxiously asked him why he had come to the morgue. The Duke answered him nothing, but only looked at Bertha interestedly. She also looked at him. Although this man was handsome and she liked him, she still regarded him with caution. Bertha lifted her dress and bowed elegantly and said her name was Bertha Alberhart. She realized it was Herzog's first time in the morgue. He stared at her in silence for a while. Then he came closer and took her hand and kissed it gently, then said it was his pleasure to meet her. Not only her beautiful face and enchanting eyes caught his attention, but her deep cleavage beckoned to him. Duke's face and ears instantly turned red with embarrassment. He coughed a couple times and looked away, trying to calm himself and keep her from realizing what had happened. Then, he asked her how she'd ended up in the morgue. She immediately cried and made a very sad face. Wiping her tears with a handkerchief, she sadly replied that the patient she was caring for had passed away the other day. The Duke looked at her sympathetically and said it was so generous of her. Bertha continued to cry and told him that she still couldn't come to her senses. Apologizing, Bertha asked him to leave the morgue so that she could say goodbye to the deceased. The Duke was very much surprised at this request, but he was sympathetic to her and replied that he hoped that her sadness would be at least a little dispelled. Then the Duke bowed to her and walked quickly away, leaving her and Hans in the morgue. Bertha was pleased that she had managed to persuade him to leave them. Leaving the morgue, Herzog discreetly turned around and looked at her again, thinking about Bertha not being comfortable around him. But Bertha continued to stand still and mourn for the patient she was looking after. The Duke noticed that Bertha had changed and was acting differently. As soon as the Duke left, Bertha stopped crying. She smiled and told Mr. Hans to go on with his work. Once Rosa's body was cremated, she took the box containing her ashes and quickly went outside. Bertha was glowing with happiness and hummed something joyfully to herself. She quickly scattered the ashes in the wind and laughed happily. She then threw the box with the remains of the ashes on the ground and said contentedly that she felt so relieved because she could now not worry about Rita. She reflected on the fact that the only one left was Elsa, who knew her secret, but Bertha decided that she might need him, so she decided to observe him. Then she returned home. The next day, the sun was shining brightly, warming everything around. The white fluffy clouds floating in the blue sky drew the eye to this beauty. Bertha was already awake and sitting in front of the mirror, brushing her gorgeous hair while singing a song happily. She looked at the maids, who were talking animatedly about something. After a while, she looked at Jean, who looked sad and said the weather was so lovely and just perfect for a walk. Jen immediately became more cheerful and asked Bertha where she would like to go. Smiling, Bertha cheerfully replied that when the warm spring breeze blew, she thought of her friends. Jean was greatly surprised and thought she had misheard, so she asked, "What, about friends?" She asked Bertha if she wanted Jean to send her request to Duke Shade. Of course, Bertha was surprised too, and for a while silently pondered how she should proceed. Jean looked at her sadly, silently awaiting further instructions. Bertha finally asked Jean if she really only wanted to send the letter to Duke Shade and wouldn't the other friends be upset, but Jean was even more upset and apologized to Bertha because she didn't know who her friends were. She looked guiltily at Bertha and seemed about to cry. Then she said if Bertha told her who she was friends with, Jean would send a request to those people immediately. Bertha angrily continued to look at Jean, showing how unhappy she was with her work. Jean closed her eyes, clenched her hands into fists, and lowered her head. Her body trembled as if awaiting punishment. Bertha was surprised that the previous mistress of the body had only one friend. She ordered Jean to send a request to Duke Shade and try to get a reply before lunch. The maid replied that she would do everything. Then she quickly ran to do her errand. Bertha continued brushing her hair, thinking that it was still not bad that the Duke of Oslan was a friend of the previous Bertha. Still, Bertha managed to get an answer from Duke Shade, and after a while she arrived at his luxurious, huge mansion. The weather was glorious. She was joyfully greeted by Julia Shade, the eldest daughter of the Shade family. This lush girl was very happy to see Bertha. Bertha smiled back, thanking Julia sincerely for inviting her. Julia said that she was disappointed that they hadn't heard from each other lately. Bertha replied that she had been a bit busy and asked her to apologize for that. Julia smiled, sympathetic to Bertha, and said it was a familiar thing. Bertha, watching Julia, noticed that she looked much softer than she had imagined her to be. She wondered why the previous Bertha had avoided contact with Julia. Suddenly, Bertha remembered Jean saying that all the time when asked to meet, Julia sent letters saying she was very busy. And so sitting at the table next to this smiling, joyful Julia, Bertha felt something strange in her behavior. Julia asked Bertha how she had been doing all this time they had not seen each other. Bertha, holding a cup of aromatic tea, sadly replied that she had a lot to do, and a patient she had been caring for a long time had passed away a couple of days ago. Julia looked at Bertha with empathy and said, "My goodness, you were a volunteer at a place sponsored by Grand Duke Van Brandt, right?" Bertha replied that that was correct. She realized that what she had said did not seem strange to Julia. For a while longer, Julia looked at her sympathetically, saying what a pity. Then Julia took a plate with a piece of chocolate cake with strawberries and gave it to Bertha, telling her that she had bought it in the best store in the capital, especially for Bertha, who loved such cakes. Bertha thanked her for it and gladly took such an appetizing cake, which she was eager to try. Meanwhile, Julia asked her how Bertha was doing with her fiancé. After tasting a piece of cake, which melted in her mouth, Bertha could not stop and took a second piece and continued to enjoy it. Then she smiled and replied, "I don't even know." But Julia did not stop there and said with a smile, perhaps Count Lawrence still disliked Bertha. However, Bertha remained silent and continued to smile, thinking about why Julia was suddenly so curious. Bertha remembered her fiancé's face when he had enjoyed watching the Baron kiss so much. She wondered if Julia liked such a candidate. Still, Julia apparently wasn't going to stop there, so she said it was so typical of the victim of an arranged marriage. She also reminded Bertha that she should tell Count Alberhart everything directly and say that she was not ready to marry. Julia asked if that wasn't a good idea. However, Bertha simply ignored her and continued to enjoy the cake. Suddenly, Julia's eyes sparkled, and she advised Bertha to start practicing herself as she was doing. After all, if she tried hard enough, there should be no difficulties. Although Bertha didn't need her advice, she calmly continued to listen to her monologue while enjoying the flavored tea. Julia thought that perhaps Bertha, unlike her, might have difficulty with fencing, but she might find another way to apply for training for a government position. Bertha finally realized why the previous body mistress had avoided Julia, who had no friends besides Bertha. Once again, Julia smiled happily and began to brag that she was going to join the Royal Guard soon. Julia promised to help Bertha if she wanted to go there with her. Suddenly, her monologue was interrupted by a man who came leisurely toward them and said, "My goodness, what a fine lady to go out for a walk." Julia and Bertha looked in his direction in surprise. It was Brain Shade, the eldest son of the Shade family. Like Julia, he had light purple hair and blue eyes. He was a tall, fit young man. Julia looked at her brother angrily and asked why he had come. Brain paid no attention to his sister's displeasure, but looked at his guest. Bertha rose from her chair and bowed cheerfully to greet him. He looked at her tenderly and smiled. He thought Bertha looked different this time. Julia was silent and looked at Bertha unhappily. She didn't like the fact that all the attention went not to her, but to her guest. Brain walked over to Bertha and taking her hand said she was so beautiful. His words surprised and embarrassed her a little, but his gentle gaze and charming smile, just like a magnet, attracted to him. Bertha also smiled back at him and looked into his sea-like blue eyes. Of course, she noticed the displeased look Julia was giving them, but pretended not to notice it and continued to smile at her brother. Brain said with a smile that he thought it was time for Bertha to leave, so he offered to walk her out. Bertha gladly agreed to his proposal, and then smiling happily, told Julia that they would see each other next time. In fact, Bertha hoped that she and Julia would never see each other again. Bertha took Brain under her arm and tried to keep up with him. He said that the dress she was wearing was very different from what she usually wore. She replied that her preferences had changed, and besides, it was spring outside. Brain thought the new style suited her better than the old style, and she looked like a magnolia flower. Bertha said he was so good to her. Then she mentioned Julia, who would soon be entering the Royal Academy. She assumed that he felt strongly about her enrollment. He sighed heavily and replied that he had a lot on his mind. Brain was sure that the day would come when Julia would make a mistake guarding the royal family, and then the Shade family's inheritance would go to him. Then he asked Bertha, "You know what I'm talking about, don't you?" Bertha remained silent and only smiled back, which indicated that she understood him perfectly. A carriage was already waiting for her outside the Shade family's estate. Bertha bade him farewell and decided to get into the carriage. But Brain pulled her arm sharply toward him, and she didn't notice how close she was to him. His actions surprised her. She didn't understand why he was suddenly so interested in her. Then Brain whispered in her ear, "If you have any ideas to ease my worries, please let me know. I will make every effort to cooperate with you." Bertha looked carefully into his eyes. She realized at once that Brain and Julia were competing for the inheritance, and that was why he had condescended to his sisters joining the royal guard. Now was the moment when she was deciding which of the two of them to support. Of course, Bertha understood what Julia was as a person, and if she were to inherit, she would be the head of the family. Looking at Brain, Bertha decided that supporting Julia was not a good prospect because Julia might prevent her from finding peace of mind and happiness. Brain noticed that Bertha was thinking about something, hesitating, and at the same time trying to decide. He asked her what was wrong, but Bertha was not confused, but smiled radiantly and replied that nothing had happened. Her answer and demeanor caught Brain off guard. He looked at her in surprise, but then he smiled quickly so she wouldn't notice. He thought of the way Bertha had acted before, as if she deliberately wanted his attention, but now it was as if she were hiding her feelings. Bertha quickly entered the carriage, and turning around with a smile on her face, thanked Brain for seeing her off, and said goodbye to him. A few days later, the sun was almost down, and gray clouds covered the blue sky. There was no one at the entrance to the Alberhart family's estate. After a while, there was a carriage near the estate, with 3 people beside it: the coachman, Brain, and a woman dressed in a red cloak. Brain approached her and said that they had met again, and their meeting was earlier than he had anticipated. The girl took off her hood, and it was clear that it was Bertha. She had agreed to support Brain. Bertha asked if he had prepared everything they had talked about last time. Brain replied with a smile that he had. He opened the carriage door and asked her if she wanted to ride along with him and check things out. She was satisfied that everything was ready and put her hood back on, then said she had a lot to talk to him about. Brain, like a true gentleman, helped her into the carriage. At this time, butler Ian, who was standing nearby, was watching them. He even stood there until the carriage drove away and was out of sight. Bertha was silent and stared out the window and thought. There were too many thoughts in her head. Brain continued to watch her discreetly because too much had changed in her demeanor. He noticed that Bertha did not hesitate to get into the dirty carriage, nor even put on her favorite dress. It seemed to him that she was a completely immature girl, but the way she looked at him now took him by surprise. He couldn't believe his eyes. Brain realized he'd been wrong. Bertha had really changed. Bertha began to smile radiantly again, like an innocent, naive girl. Brain played along and smiled back at her. He realized he was looking at a real vixen, not a scared, naive bunny. He then asked her how she knew that Graf was using the services of brothel girls. Bertha didn't want to tell him everything in detail, so she replied that it just so happened that she found out about it. That answer made him angry, though, and he looked at her unhappily. Brain didn't say anything because he knew she didn't trust him completely. He still didn't stop there and asked another tricky question. But this time, too, Bertha eluded him. She looked out the window and said with a smile, "Doesn't he know that a beautiful girl should be a mystery?" But after a couple of seconds, the smile faded and her face became sad because she began to remember how she'd found out about everything. After her mother died, she packed her belongings in a suitcase and moved in with an aristocratic family. Earl Todd's wife was a friend of her mother's, and on her recommendation, the family took her in as a governess for their son, Riven. Count Todd welcomed her with open arms and smilingly said that his wife had told him everything. Then he even kissed her on the cheek and empathized with her, telling her she was poor. Although it was strange to her, she didn't say anything. Then he even hugged her tightly and asked her to take care of their son. He also said that if she needed anything, she should not be shy, but could boldly ask and his family would help her. At that moment, she thanked him sincerely and thought that in this house, she would be able to receive protection and support. But everything changed one day when she was alone in a room with the Count. He came closer and closer to her and looked at her passionately. Rita was trembling with fear. She tearfully cried out, "Count, what's wrong with you? Don't do this, please!" But he continued to approach her and grabbed her arm. Fortunately, at that moment, his son burst into the room and saw his father grabbing his governess by the arm and trying to do something to her. Count Todd quickly took his hands away from Rita and looked at his son with fear in his eyes, afraid that he might guess his intentions. Riven looked at his frightened teacher and asked worriedly, "Teacher?" Rita lowered her crying face and, covering the neckline of her dress with her hands, answered, "Riven!" At that moment, she was not only frightened, but grateful that he had come. In the evening, Rita had dinner with the Count, his wife and son. There were meat dishes on the table, and there were vegetables, fruit, fried eggs, and wine. Everyone was enjoying the dinner. Rita looked frustrated. She concentrated on her food and silently tried to eat. Suddenly, Earl Todd, who was sitting next to her, put his hand on her leg and began to squeeze it. Apparently, he could no longer contain his attraction to her. He didn't even mind that Rita was much younger than him and that his wife and son were sitting across from him. Rita's eyes instantly filled with fear. She didn't know how to act or what to do. But the Count's son saw everything. He looked angrily at his father and asked him, "Dad, why do you keep touching Rita? She doesn't like it." The Count was shocked that his son had caught him again and didn't know what to say. Rita blushed with embarrassment. Although she hadn't done anything embarrassing, but after the Count's molestation, she felt disgusted. The Countess angrily tapped her palm on the table and looked angrily at her husband. She was not going to tolerate his behavior. She asked Riven to go to his room. He quickly got up from the table and obeyed his mother's request. The Countess looked at her husband again and said angrily that they should talk in private. The Count did not argue with his wife and obediently followed her into the other room. Rita was left sitting alone at the table. She was so excited that she could not eat anything, and with her head down, she waited anxiously for the Countess to return. After a while, the Countess returned to the room and with sadness in her eyes asked her to apologize for her husband's act. She had not expected this to happen to her friend's daughter. The Countess took Rita's hand and, barely holding back tears, said that Rita was a lady from a noble family and she didn't understand how this could have happened to her. The Countess looked sadly into Rita's eyes and quietly said that she would give her money as an apology for her husband. Then the Countess once again asked her to forgive her and said that it would be better for Rita to leave their house. She also promised that she would find another place for her to live. At that moment, Rita looked at her sadly, but realized that no one wanted her. She sat at the table for some time longer, nervously clutching her dress with her hands, while tears poured from her eyes like a stream. Bertha looked out the window and wondered what would happen if she agreed to go to the house where her mother's friend wanted her to go. She was sure that Count Todd would have found her there. She sighed heavily, then looked forward confidently, because once again she was convinced that working at the bar had been the best decision for her back then. Still, Bertha decided to stop remembering the sad past. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by Brain, who called out to her. He smiled and reported that they were almost there and told me that the place was called May Peach. That day, the sun lit up the city, the houses, the mountains, and everything around. White clouds floated slowly across the blue sky. People in the city were hurrying somewhere in carriages. At last, the coachman stopped the horses near a small white-colored building that said Half Adobo. There were crates and bags of fruit near the building. Brain looked at the building and then asked Bertha if this was where they were supposed to arrive. She confidently replied that she was correct. They entered the building and walked down a small brown-colored hallway that was lit by lamps. In the middle of the room was a man with pink-colored hair and bound hands, with many other men standing around him. He had a black blindfold over his eyes so that he could not see the people who were around him. The man shouted indignantly. He asked who they were and what they wanted from him. Suddenly, the men heard someone come in, and they turned toward the opening door. Bertha and Brain entered the room. The men bowed to them and greeted them. The man with pink hair continued to kneel and listen in bewilderment to what they were saying. Brain looked at him angrily as if he were nothing and wanted to say something, but the man interrupted him. He started making excuses, saying that it was just a regular store selling fruit, but not getting an answer, he started yelling that it was all a misunderstanding. Some man kicked him in the head and body to finally start telling the truth. Brain said he didn't need to be afraid. He smiled and explained that she wanted to propose to him. Bertha watched Brain in silence and realized that he was a devil and had his own talents. He nodded to his subordinate, signaling him to act. The man grabbed the bound man firmly by the hair and dragged him to Brain, who said they needed a man to use the services of his dirty peach business. He also explained that he was referring to Count Todd, but the blindfolded man answered nothing. Brain looked at him angrily and told him what he knew about them being good at communicating. Despite the beatings, he remained silent, as if he didn't know what it was about and was hearing about it for the first time. However, Brain wasn't about to give up. He said with a smile that it wasn't working out and that it was his fault that he couldn't make a proper impression the first time. Nevertheless, Brain offered to talk to him alone. He looked at Bertha and nodded, letting her know she could go. Bertha smiled and walked out of the room where overturned furniture lay all around. She walked down a long hallway with red carpet and scattered furniture on the floor and beautiful gold-colored chandeliers in the shape of flowers hanging overhead. She wondered how many girls had shed bloody tears in this luxurious room. Suddenly her eyes shone, and she smiled contentedly at the thought that Count Todd was also bound to feel the bitterness of life. A few days later, Count Todd came to the same establishment where Bertha and Brain had been. Like a true aristocrat, he walked with his head held high and proud. When he saw the man with pink hair, he stopped. The man bowed and greeted the Count, then asked him which peach he would like to try today. The Count asked interestedly if there was anything new. The man smiled and replied that everything was there and asked him to follow him. When he entered the room, he saw a young girl in a lacy nightie sitting on a large bed. She asked quietly, "Are you my client?" The girl had long hair. She looked at him with her golden-colored eyes, like an innocent little girl. When the Count took a closer look, he was very much surprised, because the girl in front of him looked a lot like Rita, who used to live with them, and he liked her very much. The only thing different was the color of their hair. The Count coughed and thought that if it wasn't for his son, he might have gotten to know her better. He walked over to the girl and sat down on the bed beside her. The Count said, in an affectionate voice, that she was very nice, and then asked how old she was. The girl replied that she was 17 years old. She started stroking her gorgeous hair and examining it. But when he heard she was 17, he grudgingly said she was more mature than he thought. The girl looked away and made a sad face, then picked up the bottle of wine. She was actually 25 years old, but she was willing to lie about her real age for money. She poured wine into a glass and handed it to the Count, who asked her what her name was. The Count quickly drank all the wine, and the girl replied that her name was Rita. Placing his glass on the table that stood beside the bed, the Count said she had a pretty name, and he offered to cut to the chase. After drinking the wine, the Count became so intoxicated that he couldn't even unbutton his shirt. Rita, who was standing next to the Count, realized it was time to act. She pushed the Count onto the bed and sat on top of him. The Count looked at her fearfully. The girl quickly removed his pants. At this moment, Rita remembered the girl who came to her not too long ago and gave her a bag of gold coins. She promised to pay Rita twice as much if she cut it. Rita still had a lot of gold coins in front of her eyes, thanks to which she would be able to end this kind of life and live like everyone else. So Rita didn't hesitate to take out the knife hidden next to the bed and stab the Count's manhood. There was blood all around. The Count only had time to scream, and then he lost consciousness from pain and shock. The next day came. The sun shone brightly through the window, and fluffy white clouds occasionally floated across the sky. As soon as Earl Todd woke up, he immediately grabbed his head, which was almost splitting apart from the pain. He noticed that he was in an unfamiliar place. He tried to remember what had happened yesterday, and the last thing he remembered was arriving at the May Peach. Then he suddenly remembered how the girl who looked like Rita had pushed him onto the bed and sat on top of him, and then she had quickly pulled down his pants. Grabbing a knife, she stripped him of his manhood with a single blow. Remembering this, the Count cried out sorrowfully, "Hey, is there anyone here? Please help!" Brain entered the room, glad that he was already awake. Earl Todd was surprised to see Duke Shade. He asked if he was in the Shade family mansion. Earl Todd tried to stand up, but suddenly felt a strong pain between his legs and screamed. Brain went to him and advised him not to make too sudden movements. Earl Todd asked in a trembling voice what had happened. Brain asked him if he knew the May Peach establishment. Hearing his question, Earl Todd looked at him in surprise and asked if he too was a member of this establishment. But seeing the face with which Brain was looking at him, he immediately realized his mistake. Brain told him that there was an illegal business going on in that place. That is, a brothel disguised as a fruit store. Yesterday, there had been an attack on that establishment, and the whole truth about it had been revealed. The Count was surprised to hear about it. Brain said it was his family's guard that was on the scene. Count Todd felt his body begin to tremble and that he was in an unpleasant situation. As he continued his story, Brain told him that while exploring the building, they had managed to find Earl Todd lying on the floor, bleeding from a wound he had received, but the culprit had escaped by that time. Count Todd held back all the anger that was raging inside of him so as not to hurt himself even more. Brain said that his injury was serious and he was given emergency medical attention, but there was a possibility that he could be impotent for life. Hearing this, the Count looked as if that was the end of his life. Earl Todd looked fearfully at Brain and asked in a trembling voice what he meant. Brain said nothing, but with a glance, he made it clear that the Earl had become a eunuch. The realization that Count Todd had lost his manhood was simply tearing him up inside. He began to weep bitterly again. Bertha was standing against the wall in the next room, listening to their conversation. When she heard Count Todd screaming, she thought indignantly, "Why is he screaming again?" After calming down, he asked Brain if Graf's family knew what had happened. Brain replied that they had been been told that the Count had been attacked while he was near the May Peach. The Count thanked Brain for his help. Brain explained to him that he couldn't lie forever. He reminded Earl Todd that the Shade family motto was to always be honest. Bertha was surprised to hear this. She thought that Brain had no conscience at all, and since that was his family's motto, it looked like he was an adopted son, since he didn't adhere to it at all. Earl Todd valued his reputation, so he earnestly asked that Brain not tell anyone about what had happened. Brain was gladly willing to fulfill his request on one condition. It was about his sister Julia, who was about to enter the royal guard. Without listening to Brain to the end, Earl Todd took his hand and promised that he would do everything he could to get his sister in. He also promised to see to it that she was appointed captain of the guard. Brain took his hand away abruptly and looked coldly into the distance, and asked that Count Todd reject her application to join the guard. He demanded that Count Todd make sure that Julia would never enroll. His request greatly surprised Earl Todd, and he questioned Brain in surprise as to why he wanted it. Instantly, Brain's face became sad, and he told Count Todd that he couldn't allow a frail and weak girl to join the guard. Besides, she might have been injured during her service. Honestly, speaking, Count Todd was even more at a loss, for Milady Shade, whom he had seen more than once, did not look like she was frail and weak. Brain made an even sadder face, and almost sobbing said that if something happened to her, but Earl Todd didn't let him finish and said he understood. He looked at Brain with pleading eyes and asked, "In return, you'll keep everything a secret, right?" Brain smiled and swore in his family's name that he would keep his promise. Count Todd heard this and was overjoyed and glowed with happiness, even forgetting that he had lost something important. Brain bowed to him and asked Earl Todd to rest for a while because people from his family were supposed to be coming for him soon. Brain left the room and quietly closed the door behind him. His cheeks turned red, and he laughed softly, remembering the look on the Count's face when he found out he'd lost something important between his legs. Brain thought there was something cute about that. He then went to the next door and knocked on it, and then entered the room. Bertha stood in the room near the window. She was wearing a beautiful green and white dress, and her luxurious hair was in a ponytail. When she heard Brain's voice, she turned around. Bertha and Brain bowed to each other and greeted each other. Brain thanked Bertha profusely for the help she had provided. Bertha replied that she was glad she had been able to be of service to him. Suddenly, Brain, looking her straight in the eyes, realized that he felt sorry for giving such a girl to another man. Bertha couldn't understand what this handsome, cunning fox was thinking and why he was staring at her for so long. She didn't say anything either, but only looked at him questioningly. Brain smiled again and said that if she needed anything, she could feel free to contact him. He reiterated that he was truly grateful for her help. Bertha decided not to miss the opportunity, and smiling asked if he could show his gratitude now. Her request took him by surprise. He didn't say anything and looked at her in surprise, trying to figure out what she wanted. She gazed tenderly into his eyes and smiled, trying to anticipate whether he would guess what she meant. He took her gently by the waist and looked into her bottomless sea-blue eyes and asked how he could help her. She didn't answer anything, but began to remove the glove from her left hand. As soon as the glove was off, Brain saw the bruises on her wrist. He gently took her hand and worriedly asked what was wrong that her hand was in such a state. Memories of the day when Baron Jacquard had grabbed her arm hard and pushed her onto the couch came flooding back to her. Despite her resistances and pleas not to touch her, the Baron crushed her with his body. The face he saw made Count Lawrence blush dot, and he said that her pale body under the hard pressure of the big, strong Jacquard was insanely beautiful. Bertha smiled and thought it was just payment for her new life. She told Brain that her fiancé had accidentally done it. He smiled and said that her fiancé was a pretty energetic man. Brain asked if there was anything he could do to help her. Bertha took off her second glove and asked him if he knew Baron Jacquard. To be honest, Brain was surprised that Bertha wanted to know about someone other than her fiancé. It struck him as odd, and he thought, what a load of crap. Brain went to the couch and told him that this Baron was known as an aristocrat who could have no heirs and was Mr. Lawrence's attendant. Bertha already knew that. She smiled and listened to his story in silence. Brain informed her that this was just public information that everyone knew about, but he is actually the secret owner of the Dream Gift Shop. He shared that there are some truly wonderful items available at this store. It was really a surprise to her. She thought about it and kept looking at Brain. He also didn't take his eyes off her. Brain thought Bertha was so different from the other girls. He remembered social events where there were many beautiful young aristocrats. When girls saw him, they immediately complimented him, saying that he looked great, as well as admired his beauty. Brain smiled back at them and told them that he hoped they were enjoying their time. The girls were beyond thrilled when he spoke to them. so when they saw him, they immediately ran to him with greetings. One day, one girl with russet hair and gray eyes joyfully approached him and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The brunette walked up to her and said with a smile, "Mr. Hudson, so amazing, isn't he?" Then the two girls cheerfully said that they would like to ask Brain something about this Mr. Hudson. Brain kept looking at Bertha and thought about the fact that he had had many girlfriends and she wouldn't be able to get his attention by talking about other men. But she had no intention of doing so. Bertha asked what he knew about her fiancé, Earl Lawrence, and that's when Brain realized his mistake. He had a strange look on his face, as if he'd suffered a major defeat. Despite this, he quickly pulled himself together and smiled as he realized that Bertha had no plans to make him jealous, and she was curious about her fiancé. She smiled sweetly at him and earnestly asked him to tell him everything he thought about him. Brain looked at her unhappily, and after a couple seconds of silence, he replied that he was disappointed. He couldn't believe that such a beautiful girl wanted to talk about another man. Bertha smiled and asked what she could do to make it up to her. He looked at her seductively and replied that he didn't even know what she needed to do to assuage his jealousy of her fiancé. She was curious to hear what he had to say, but he remained silent. Then she realized what he wanted. She didn't ask him anything else, but silently walked slowly toward him. Brain looked at her in surprise, trying to figure out what she was up to. Bertha didn't shy away from him, but acted confident. She looked him in the eyes, and when she saw that he was not against a closer relationship, she began to move closer to him. His cheeks flushed a little with embarrassment. It was as if he was fascinated by her and couldn't take his eyes off hers. Bertha began to kiss his neck tenderly, making his body fill with the fire of passion and a restless desire to quench his thirst. Bertha tried to help him relax even more. She continued to kiss him gently, and Brain himself didn't realize how he was in her power and didn't even resist her. She became more and more fascinated by him. Her tender kisses covered his body, and his blood boiled with passion. Brain took the initiative and kissed Bertha. She smiled contentedly. Then she kissed him behind his ear. Bertha kissed his earlobe with her lips. Her left hand went below her waist. Brain looked surprised at her activity, but did not resist her. Bertha began to whisper something in his ear. The girl felt Brain start to melt from her touch. His body was hot from her kisses and the pleasant massage. Brain didn't want the girl to stop. She saw that he was completely in her power and smiled contentedly, and then whispered affectionately for him to wake up. Brain quickly opened his eyes and realized that he had let his guard down and fallen for her seduction. Bertha fixed her hair and smiled at the confused Brain and said that she hoped that the next time they met, he would give her enough information. Brain continued to sit on the couch and watched excitedly as Bertha picked up her gloves and headed for the door. She smiled goodbye and said there was no need to see her off. Brain awkwardly waved back at her. He still couldn't quite recover from his pleasant time with her. Bertha opened the door wide open and turned around and said she had to go. Brain went to the window. It was already dark outside, and the stars and moon lit up everything around him. He remembered everything that had happened to him today. It had started with Bertha asking him to show his gratitude, and then her charms and caresses simply clouded his mind. And when she whispered for him to wake up, he came to his senses as if her spell had broken. Brain recognized that he had let his guard down and succumbed to her so easily. He realized that Bertha was a very dangerous woman. He kept looking up at the starry sky and decided he should keep his distance from her for a while. Bertha, returning to her manor, quickly went to the living room. She sat down on the couch and sighed heavily. After all, it had been such a refreshing yet tiring day. She needed to rest and take a bath. Suddenly, she smelled the pleasant aroma of herbal oils. Someone began to massage her head and neck. The touch of the hands was so soothing and relaxing to her. She asked if it was Jean, but when she looked up, she saw Butler's face as he massaged her and asked if she had regained consciousness. He smiled and said he saw her tired and decided to give her a massage. She didn't mind the massage, so she let him continue what he had started. Bertha thought that Butler was so good at massages, and it annoyed her a lot. The butler said that she had gotten very close to Duke Shade lately. He reminded her that it was not proper for a girl who had a fiancé to be so close to other men. When Butler offered to relieve the fatigue of her body, she turned sharply toward him, preventing him from touching her body. He looked at her in surprise. Bertha quickly stood up and moved farther away from him, then shouted angrily that she had told him to stay out of her sight. The butler looked at her sadly and replied that he was doing everything for her. She wasn't going to put up with his excuses and molestation any longer, so Bertha slapped him. The impact was so hard that his monocle fell to the floor. Bertha was very angry with Butler. She promised him that next time he would not get off so lightly. He picked up a monocle and, putting it over his right eye, asked her not to forget that Lawrence was her fiancé and she should take care of Count Alberhart's reputation. Bertha was surprised at his words and asked what he meant, but the butler did not answer her question. question, but said that it was time for him to leave and asked her to have a good rest. Then he left so quickly that even Bertha looked at him in surprise. As soon as the door closed, Bertha shouted loudly, angrily, "What do you think you're doing?" Of course, Bertha realized that Butler was acting this way because there was someone behind his back, but she wondered how long they'd be covering for him. The next day in the evening, Bertha decided to go somewhere, and so she asked Jean to accompany her. She wore a seductive translucent white dress, and Jean did her beautiful hair. Today, she wanted to look very seductive. She looked at the sheer sleeves of her dress and decided that the moment she appeared, she needed a scent that could easily stupefy the person she was talking to. Jean helped Bertha put on a blue hooded cloak so no one would recognize her. Jean gave Bertha the red lipstick and suggested that she give the perfume to her. Bertha did so. She painted her lips with red lipstick, and when she saw her reflection in the mirror, she was pleased with her image, which in her opinion was perfect. Then she walked up to Jean and said they had to go. Jean obediently followed her. It was already dark outside. The stars in the sky were shining brightly. The alleys were quiet, and there was no one in sight. Bertha, along with Jean, walked quickly down a quiet alleyway to one unusual place. They climbed the steps and saw the house they were looking for. There was a light on inside, so they hurried inside the store. There was a banner outside the store that said here people could find the gift they had been dreaming of. Bertha smiled and thought it was so old-fashioned. Before entering the store, Bertha asked Jean if she remembered everything Bertha had told her. Jean quickly replied that she didn't have to worry because she remembered everything perfectly. But Bertha asked if Jean remembered what she had to do. The maid smiled and assured her that she remembered everything, and Bertha just had to trust her. Bertha was pleased with her answer and realized once again that Jean was a very bright girl. Bertha was pleased that she had chosen her to be her maid. They quickly entered the store. Jean went first, followed by Bertha. There were many books and other things in the store. They were met there by a young blonde-haired man who wore glasses and was a salesman. He scrutinized the new customers. He greeted them and, trying to help them, asked if they were looking for anything in particular. Bertha began to look around. There was indeed a large selection of goods in the store. She asked the salesman, "Are these all the items that are on sale?" He quickly replied that she was right. Bertha reached out, trying to take something, and the cloak opened, and it became apparent that her hand was bandaged. The salesman noticed the bandage on her arm and looked at her empathetically. Bertha saw him looking at her and looked back at him innocently, trying to charm him. The salesman quickly fell under her spell and couldn't take his eyes off her. His cheeks flushed a little with embarrassment. Jean quickly covered Bertha and angrily said that she didn't think the store had what her mistress needed. The salesman apologized and asked what they would like to purchase. And then Bertha stepped forward and looked at the salesman with a pleading look in her eyes and said she needed something that could help give her a good night's sleep. The salesman was shocked and looked at her nervously, for he had already guessed what she meant. Bertha said in a pleading voice that she wanted Sleeping Beauty. Earlier, Brain told her that the secret store that gives dreams is a regular store on the surface, but it actually sells forbidden items. Bertha was surprised and asked what the forbidden thing was. Brain decided not to hide it from her, so he told her that they were powerful hallucinogenic drugs. They also sell sleeping pills there, a drop of which can put a horse to sleep. They also have stimulants that can suck out a person's energy every night. He also heard that they sell a poison for suicides, which, when drunk, makes a person fall asleep, and it's called Sleeping Beauty. By the look on the salesman's face, who remained silent and tried to look away, Bertha realized he didn't want to sell it to her, but she was not confused, but went up to him, and taking his hand and looking into his eyes in a pleading voice, asked him to help her. The salesman couldn't resist her, and quickly replied that he would honor her request, and asked her to wait for a minute, and went to get the poison himself. At that time, the street became lively. Children and adults were busy doing something, some shopping and some doing things. Bertha, as soon as she left the store, asked Jean if she had taken care of everything. Jean replied with a smile that she had prepared everything, and that if she sensed danger, she would immediately call the guards waiting by the wagon. Bertha realized that she could be relied upon. Then Bertha went forward, and Jean walked a little behind her, as they had agreed. There were already many people in the street. Bertha walked on slowly, wondering if he would fall into her trap, but when she heard a man call out to her to stop, she realized that he was caught. Bertha did not react to the man's words, but kept walking. Behind her, a worried Baron Jacquard was running to catch up with her. He was breaking through the crowd of people who were blocking his way. He finally managed to catch up with her, and he grabbed her shoulder to stop her, and then took her by the waist and held her in place. Bertha pushed him away and made a frightened face and shouted, "What's the matter?" Baron Jacquard continued to hold her tightly by the waist and smelled the heady fragrance that emanated from her. He took her by the arm and dragged her into an alley where they would not be disturbed. Bertha shouted something and followed him, unable to free herself from him. Baron Jacquard looked her in the eye and said that he had heard that she had purchased something from the store. He asked angrily if she was having suicidal thoughts again. Bertha looked away and coldly replied that it had nothing to do with him. Baron Jacquard held out his hand and demanded that she give up the poison while he asked her nicely. She looked at him fearfully, and then she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. Baron Jacquard warned her if she did not give up the poison on her own, he would have to take it away by force. But Bertha remained silent and would not give it up. Then, Baron Jacquard pressed her against the wall and looked menacingly into her eyes and told her not to blame him. He tore off her cloak and the buttons flew in different directions. Bertha looked at him confused. Seeing her in her translucent white dress and smelling her fragrance, Baron Jacquard could not resist such a temptation and hugged her tightly. He was mesmerized by her beautiful body. Bertha sharply pushed him away and covered herself with her arms, demanding that he not do it. But the Baron grabbed her arms again and pressed her against the wall, preventing her from breaking free of his embrace. His whole body burned with desire to possess her. He continued to hold her by the waist. His face turned red. Bertha could feel his passionate breath. Bertha couldn't and wouldn't stop him just yet. She looked to the side and saw Jean standing nearby, watching everything. Jean held the whistle in her hands and looked into the alley where Bertha was. Because it was dark, she couldn't tell if Mistress was in danger. Meanwhile, Bertha decided that everything would be all right because there were lots of people around and Jean was close by, so she was willing to be patient for a while. After quenching her thirst a bit, Baron Jacquard quickly took from her the pouch of poison that was tied to her belt. Bertha turned around abruptly and, realizing what had happened, and with tears in her eyes screamed, "No!" Baron Jacquard grabbed her arm and pressed her against the wall, pinning her down with his huge body. Bertha asked sadly why he was doing this to her. Then she cried and said, because he knows Jean is the devil. Her words were true. He understood that, but he remained his subordinate, and so he couldn't let her die. Bertha whispered sadly that it was the only way to escape from him. He didn't answer a word, and for a while he just continued to hold her hands. Then he let go of her hands and turned around and said that no matter what, she couldn't die, and he would watch her. Then he walked quickly forward, and Bertha stared silently at his back. Tears were still running down her face, and she realized that perhaps Baron Jacquard was in love with Bertha. A few seconds later, a worried Jean came running in, asking if she was okay. She picked up Bertha's cloak and helped her put it on. Jean said she couldn't see anything, so she didn't know if everything was okay. She cried and asked her to forgive her. Bertha smiled and replied that everything was fine and she shouldn't cry. After putting on her cloak, Bertha said she was very tired and wanted to go home. She wanted very much to drink the tea Jean would make for her. Her words soothed Jean, and she wiped away her tears and was ready to follow her mistress. Bertha went quickly forward, and Jean followed her, cheerfully promising that she would make the most delicious tea for her. When she woke up, Bertha cleaned herself up and applied a new perfume to her wrist. Then she asked Jean if the letter from Julia had arrived. Jean replied sadly that she had not heard from her. She apologized and promised to send Julia a second letter about the visit. Bertha assumed that Julia was now burning with shame at not being able to join the guard. She smiled and asked Jean to keep sending her letters requesting a visit. Jean clenched her palms into fists and resolutely replied that she would do her errand. After changing her clothes, Bertha picked up a brown pouch from the table that lay next to the letters. She looked at him carefully and smiled contentedly, thinking that everything was going the way she wanted it to. She came into the living room, where a long-awaited guest in a brown cloak was sitting at the table waiting for her. She smiled and greeted him. It was Elsa. He looked at her unhappily, waiting for an explanation as to why she had called him. Bertha sat back in her chair and asked him to forgive her for disturbing him. As soon as she placed her hand on the table, he smelled the light scent of perfume she had applied to her wrist. He was very surprised because he didn't even expect to smell it again. This fragrance was so familiar to him. He immediately recognized it and remembered the hot desert sun, the camel caravans, the vast sands with beautiful oases, and his home state of Tatum.